Hello everybody, it's Invalid, and today we got another speed art going on, but this time instead of having just music in the background, I'm actually going to be telling a story which is kind of the inspiration for this piece of art. Don't Leave Me Angel. So this kind of goes back to my days in Idaho. It's been a fair while since I've experienced this, but it's been forever burned in my memory. Simply because of how random it was. Um, for those of you who have been paying attention to my outdoor videos, you may remember a couple videos in Idaho where I was going onto a beach next to a bridge and looking at a bridge on Lake Pendoriel that was where the train would pass by every so often. Um, and there was near that spot, right above it actually, was a sort of diving platform kind of thing, or a very small docking platform. And around that were a few trees. Nearby was a campfire that had seen a fair amount of use. And it so happened that on one of these days when I was out and about late at night and there was nothing open except the except the local Safeway, I decided, I feel like going over to that spot. So I did. I went over. It was about 10 in the evening, so it's world's very dark, just street lights lighting everything up. Um, I drive up, park in the parking lot that leads to that trail, and walk down it. Got to the point where I'm about to head off the trail to go to the platform, and I noticed there was a guy sitting there under one of the trees with a bicycle kind of lying on its side next to him, and he had a laptop in his lap. But this wasn't any ordinary laptop either. This was one of those big, bulky ones that looked like it was straight out of the 80s or something. It was really quite a piece of work. Very bulky, very big, with a very small screen. And he had a can of some sort of beverage next to him and a cigarette in his mouth. And it's 10 in the evening. I'm not exactly the most trusting person in the world when it comes to first encounters, so I was kind of not wanting to. I was hesitant to approach this person, and it's 10 in the evening, nobody else is around, so it's kind of like, well, what's he doing here? Um, and I didn't really feel like talking anyway, so I kind of felt the little knife at my belt and started walking in this big circle around him to get to where I would normally sit. And I was actually past him, and I was just about to walk onto the docking platform and sit down, and suddenly I hear this voice. Hey kid, come over, say hi. Well, I can either completely ignore him and look like an ass, or I can go over and see what he has to say. So I did. I went over and sat down next to him, and he never asked my name. He never asked my name. He just started talking about the most random things, starting with his computer. And about 5 minutes into his talk, he suddenly asked me a question. Do you know what Java is? Well, yeah, it's a coding language. Of course I know what Java is. I'm one of the modern, one of the kids of the modern world. I would be surprised if somebody from the first world doesn't know what Java is if they're 15 or older. So I said, yeah, I know what Java is. I haven't programmed with it, but I know what it is. It's like, okay, good. You're smart. You're intelligent. It's like, okay. I don't know what the hell he was talking about. And then he started going into talking about different coding languages and stuff like that, and something about the secure operating system versus the non-secure stuff which they had way back in the day when the internet first came out. And with the internet, you could access pretty much any computer that was connected to it without any issues whatsoever, including the NSA. Quite apparently, including the NSA. So apparently there was something with Bill Gates to make a protected whatever or something like that, and protected systems so you couldn't access everything that you wanted to right off the bat. And just all sorts of weird stuff. And he got into conspiracy theories and all this other stuff. And he was a kind of a, I wouldn't call him dirty. He definitely wasn't homeless, but he had this kind of weathered look to him. You know, he's got more than a 5 o'clock shadow. His hair and his face is kind of scruffy with half shaved fur kind of thing, with half shaved fuzz. Um, and he seemed to be. I couldn't put an age on him. I mean, he could have been anywhere from early 40s to late 60s for all I know. But compared to 20-year-old me, he was a fair bit older than me. He was definitely my senior. Um, but he was talking about coding things and conspiracy theories like what was it? I think it was Whitewater or something like that that happened in the time of Clinton's presidency, and all sorts of other stuff like that. And at some point, he got up and, well, at some point in the conversation, which was rather one-sided for the most part, I kind of realized that he was not exactly sober. A few times he would turn to me and talk, and I'd catch the scent of something spiked on his breath, something with booze, and his beverage of choice in a, I don't know, it was like a 20-ounce can or something like that. At one point fell over, and I righted it for him, and I realized that it was a spiked fruit punch. This man was definitely not sober. And as such, I was just hearing everything that came to mind for him. His inhibitions were completely gone. Just completely gone. And he exuded this kind of really interesting air as he talked. It's like he was sort of like he knew a lot more than he was letting on. And he was about to let me know what he knew, kind of thing. Um, and there was this there was this whole thing with um, lighting a match to light another cigarette that I remember, and having some trouble with that for him, and I ended up helping him to light it, which was rather interesting. Never thought I'd do that, but I did. I helped someone light a cigarette, even though I've never smoked in my life, and I don't plan to. But at some point, he ended up standing up and putting his laptop away and all this other stuff, and picked up his bike and he started walking off. So I'm kind of like, okay, well, I guess that's the end of that. So I can go sit down and just enjoy the rest of my night, right? But something told me to wait there and watch him leave. And I did. I stood there and I watched and waited. And he reached the sidewalk and started off a little ways, and then he stopped and looked back at me and waved me on. Come on, come join with me. Let's talk. Let's continue talking. Let's continue talking, boy. And it's like, well, I can say yes or I can say no, and it's pretty obvious which choice will produce the more interesting outcome. So I shrugged and I followed him, and there I was walking back up the sidewalk to the parking lot with this strange man who had much more to say on all sorts of things. And at some point we reached the parking lot after he continually talked. And he began talking about this the place where he stays at, this what was it called? What did he call it? The Great Glass Lake or something like that. I know it had glass in it. It's been a while since I've had this experience, but so some of the details are going to be a bit fuzzy. The Great Glass Pond, I think is what it was. And somehow we got into the subject of tractors. And I don't know how, but he was telling me about how tractors originated and the whole diesel engine patent that happened during World War I, which the Germans apparently had come up with originally, and he apparently had a couple of those old tractors on the property that he was staying on, and he said at some point he stopped and he's like, I'd like to show you those tractors. How about you come to my place and I'll show you those tractors. It's like, well, once again, it's that pivotal moment where I can say yes and have something interesting happen, or I can say no and the whole deal's off. And you can guess which one I chose. I was curious, so I said yes. And he went into the gas station nearby and bought a couple things and came back and locked up his bike, and we both got into my car and and we drove up to the side of this mountain. And he's pointing out some neighbors and stuff like that as we're passing by. But we get onto the property and there's just a whole mess of trees and stuff like that. It was absolutely beautiful in the middle of the night. It was probably 20 to midnight by the time we actually got up there. We had been talking for a long time, at least he had. So we get up there and it's just trees, and the only thing lighting anything there is the moon. And it's 3/4 full and it's shining down on everything. Absolutely beautiful. And we're pulling into the parking lot, and it's not even a parking lot, it's not even paved, it's just this empty space that they've cleared out, covered in sand, with cars lining one side of it, and this random fallen log that's just propped up behind them. And I pulled into this one spot that was free and parked there and turned off the car. And from where we were, behind my car, a little ways off, was a minivan and a little trailer attached to it. On the left were the rest of the cars that were lined up, and off to the right, down the hill a fair ways, was a truck, was a flatbed, not a 4x4 or a pickup. It was a truck that had the capacity to become an 18-wheeler, and it had a flatbed with something big on it. And the stranger opened the door and pulled out another cigarette and started to light it with a match, and said, "You see that flatbed over there? There's a, what did he call it? Was it some sort of RD8 or something like that? I don't remember what it was called. Some sort of tractor, really old, German original design." He said, "Go take a look at it." Like, well, I'll humor the guy. Sure, I'll take a look at it. And I felt this curiosity, this really unusual motivation to go in and inspect it as I was going. But it's more like I wasn't necessarily I wasn't actually curious about the tractor. It's just I had all these stories that this man had told me about the past, and I think that was fueling my curiosity. And I went up, and it's like, wow, this thing is really old, and the novelty of that was pretty cool. But it was a tractor. It was big, it was red, and had a plow on the front of it, and some hydraulic stuff, and vacuum pumps, or vacuum tubes, I should say, and it was a tractor. But it was kind of cool to see it, you know? It's like what he was telling me was true. He had this really old tractor on it, on a on a on a on a flatbed. So I looked around and explored it a little bit, and came back to him, and he had moved to the minivan and had the door open and pointed past it and said, "Over there, over there, that's the Cat 20. Check him out." So I went over there with my little flashlight on my keychain and started looking at this, and it was a fair bit larger than the other tractor. It was big, and it was yellow, but otherwise the same. It had a plow and a little roof over the seating area, and he said, "Hey, go on, climb on it, check it out." And I climbed on it and sat in the driver's seat, which is actually surprisingly comfortable, and looked at the control dials and whatnot, and got back down, and it was a tractor. But the stories that he had told me before were what really made it interesting, and so it's like, wow, this is kind of novel. And then I went back to him. I returned to him, and he said, "Come with me. I want to show you some things." And that phrasing in a horror movie is always what you know something bad's going to happen. And that kind of triggered for me. And I'm starting to feel the knife at my belt again. My little buck knife with the flicky switch thing. It's not a switchblade, but as he started leading me up the hill, I kind of pulled that thing out just a little bit and opened it up, and put it back in my pocket, in my jacket pocket, and had my hand on it the entire time we were walking up. It's like, is this gonna get weird or what? I was starting to want to trust this guy, but I didn't know what to expect. But as we're going up, we're passing by, we're going up this fairly wide sandy road, heading up this slope, and we eventually come across some buildings and some tractors, some much smaller tractors that have actually been pulled in half. The front cover was, like 4 or 5 feet in front of the rest of the tractor, and the engine was all exposed, and a main cylinder that housed everything was out in the open. And he stops and points at them and says, "Those things, those are just toys." I do work with the tractors here on the property. And he leads me on, and we come to this fairly large building. It's not massive, but it's like a house. It looked like it could have it looked like it could have a couple stories. And he goes and opens the door and walks through and kind of beckons with a hand for me to follow him, and I do. I follow him in there. I close the door behind me, and he turns on a light. And inside, there's just tools lining every single wall. And in the middle of the space is this tractor. Same thing as the ones outside. It's been pulled in half with the engine exposed and the shell a few feet in front of it. And he points all around at the different tools, all sorts of screwdrivers and wrenches and whatnot. And he smiles at me and says, these are all just toys. And he leads me back outside, and then we continue on until we reach this house with the road the road kind of curves down and heads downward along this little slope alongside the house. And we start heading down this slope, and he stops me and points up at the little building and says, "In there lives the wise one. In there lives the old one. He's wise." And then we continue down to this little pond kind of place, and the forest at this point was mostly silent, with the exception of one frog that was continually going rap, 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 rap. And when we got to the edge of the pond, I realized that frog was coming from the opposite end. And when we approached the edge and stopped, the frog stopped too. And it became really quiet. All that was there was the breeze that would occasionally wander through the trees, and a great horned owl that would call. Other than that, it was completely silent. And the pond surface was still. Perfect reflection of the trees surrounding it above. And after a moment of silence, the stranger, without turning to me, said, This is the glitter glass pond. And then he turned to me and raised his hands up and said, "Here, in the glitter glass pond, you can see the past and the future." And he turned back to the pond and was silent. And then he started walking back to where we had come from, and I followed him. Not quite sure what to make of what he was saying. And we got back to my car. And he turned to me and he asked me a question. If you could go anywhere you wanted, no limitations, you have a car, you have money, if you could go anywhere you wanted, where would you go? I have no idea. And I said as much. I don't know. I don't know where I'd go. He said, I can provide. I have a way of getting Ben Franklin's. All the Ben Franklins you could need. Where would you go? Ben Franklin's, of course, he was referring to as a $100 bill. I still didn't know. I'm 20. I don't know where I want to go yet. And he got this funny look on his face with this goofy smile, and he said, "You know what? Let's go to Yakima." I have no idea where the hell Yakima is. I'll go grab Ben Franklin and we can head there. Okay. I didn't have anything else I was going to do the next day, and he asked me about it, and I said as much. I didn't have anything planned. Let's go to Yakima. So he walked over to his minivan and opened the door, and he wasn't kidding. He pulled out a $100 bill from a wallet and walked over to me, and we got in the car and we headed back down to the edge of the mountain and onto the Highway 95, and he began talking again. So here we're going to be taking a right. We're going to take a right, and then you go forth. Go forth, traveler. Okay. So I hung a right and drove south on 95, and then he started talking some more about the most random things, like things that had gone on between the Coeur d'Alene Indians or the Coeur d'Alene Native Americans and the whites that came in and had a dispute with them over Lake Coeur d'Alene. And how they ended up coming upon an agreement. This was something that apparently happened only several years ago, by the way. This wasn't like last century. This was like maybe 2 or 3 years ago when they made and settled this agreement, where they actually divided the lake in half. And the city of Coeur d'Alene would use their half of the lake for everything they needed to. Hydroelectric power, municipals, that kind of thing. And the Coeur d'Alene Indians would use their half as they needed. And my question was, well, how do you divide a lake in half? And he started getting into sine, cosine, and tangent, is what he called it. The way I learned to pronounce it was sine, cosine, and tangent. The parts of a triangle, which I think it's sine, cosine, and hypotenuse, but I knew what he was talking about. And how if you use sine, cosine, and tangent, you can divide anything. All you need are 3 points. And they used one point of the lake to another point of the lake, and then a star up in the sky. And that's how they divided the lake. Well, cool. And he started getting into other stories about Native Americans and some not so pleasant agreements that occurred between them. And we ended up, and we hit a gas station, and he said, "Let's pull over. Let's fill up the tank and get some food and things for us, and some oil to. We need to check your oil just to be sure." So we pulled into the gas station, and I filled up on a tank. He paid for it, and we went over to a Super One that was right behind the gas station, and got some oil and some jerky and some other snacky stuff, and checked the oil and did some changing, and then we continued south on 95 until we hit the Interstate 90 junction, and he said, "Hang a right here and go forth, traveler." And I did. I hung a right and went west on I-90. And I was kind of wondering where Yakima was when he was originally proposing this idea of heading out to Yakima. I thought it was like, well, was that like, I thought maybe it wouldn't be very far, like maybe 40 minutes away, right? That was my thought. That was my guess. It's a little good time for a little adventure, you know. So we're driving along I-90, which goes all the way across Washington State. And we exit Idaho, and we get over the Idaho-Washington State border. I'm kind of starting to wonder where Yakima actually is, and we're heading through Spokane, and we end up passing Spokane, and as we head out of Spokane and the city disappears into neighborhoods and small shopping centers, and that starts to give way to trees and wheatgrass fields, and eventually we're just driving through, and all we see all around us are these moonlit rolling hills of wheatgrass, and that's all there is to see aside from the cars ahead and behind us. And the strangers nodding off every so often, and I check the clock on my car's dashboard, and it's 3 in the morning. It's like, how much longer are we going to be driving here? And he starts, every so often, he wakes up and tells me a little bit more. It's getting more personal. He's starting to talk about his childhood. How he had a Corvair, and his nemesis at school was this guy with like a Firebird or something like that. I can't remember exactly what he drove, but the stranger referred to the Corvair as the poor man's Porsche. Or something to that effect. And how he had a street race, and how his teacher, can't remember which teacher it was, but one of his teachers now owned the Corvair along with a few others. Like 6 out of 30 left in the nation or something like that. And how we would visit him later that day. And as we continued on, he started to talk more about needing to contact his mother, who lived in Yakima. And how he was half-blood Yakima Indian. His, as I found out later, his mother was full-blood and his father was um, European, full-blood European. Which to me explained a lot of why his naming was so focused on the characteristics of me, and he never actually asked my name. He just gave me names, like Boy and Traveler. And how he had this really reverent way of talking about everything, even if he didn't like it. Um, Including his mother. And as we got further and further into the middle of Washington, he was talking about how he needed to alert his mother, let him know that the traveler needed a place to rest. And how he was looking forward to some of Mom's hot soup, if she was making it. And he would continue to nod off and say some more. And we ended up coming upon a ridge. And I saw a sign that said Seattle 100 something miles. And there was something for Yakima, about 60 miles. Oh my god, it's 4 in the morning. And this isn't, by the way, this is Idaho. Anybody who lives in the northern climates, or in the southern climates, and I'm not talking about Georgia, I'm talking about Australia and stuff like that. You know what it's like to live on those extremes in latitude. And this is about springtime, late spring, getting on to summer. And the sun comes up early. It's 4 o'clock, and the sky is starting to turn pink from the sun that's rising up behind us. And he wakes up again and points in some general direction of the ridge. Follow the signs to Yakima. When we get to the ridge, you're going to be going, in order to get to Seattle, you would go over the ridge. But to get to Yakima, we're going to be following it. We're going to be following it south. And he started fading out again, and I followed his directions. I saw the turnoff for Yakima, and I followed it, and just like he said, we ended up going onto the ridge and onto the mountain ridge and followed it south. And when we did that, I saw Yakima 30 miles. And we headed down to Yakima, and I was just following the signs to get there, and we eventually got to this one town surrounded by all sorts of different farms. And he kind of woke up when we got there and said, are we there? Yep, we're here. Thank God for this angel. Thank you, God, for the angel you have sent me. I thought that's kind of interesting to say. So we're getting into Yakima, and he starts getting a little edgy. He's telling me how Yakima's not a good town. It's bad. Yakima's a bad town. and he's pointing at different people. Some women crossing the street, and they're not terribly well dressed. They look like they've seen better days, and he's pointing at them and says, "You see them? I can bet you that she's a prostitute." Okay, that was came a little out of left field for me. So I look at the gas tank, and it's less than half full. So we pull into a gas station, and he start filling up the tank, and he says, "Yakima's, stay next to the car. You never know what's going to happen here. This is a bad town. This town is bad." But before he leaves to go pay the person at the register, he says, "Don't leave me here. Don't leave me here, Angel." I won't. I'm not going anywhere. As he heads inside, that's just like the strangest thing. Why would he assume I would leave him? He pays, I fill the tank up, and he comes back, and we start heading out to his mother's place. And as we're doing that, he gets, early on, he was talking about his mom's hot soup and sounding really really happy about it, kind of like that 12-year-old that's been out for a whole day and comes home to that wonderful meal that his parents have cooked up. It's just, just shove it in the mouth and not even chew, just swallow it all. And it's so delicious because it's food. You don't really care what you're eating. It had that kind of feeling before, but as we're getting closer to where his mom is, he's getting less and less interested in staying there and having a visit. He's starting to talk more and more about how we're just going to stop by and visit and say hi. And don't let her, and he's warning me, don't let her catch you, because don't let her keep you, because she's crazy. She's crazier than I am. And we're driving along into this neighborhood of Yakima, and the houses are kind of dilapidated and not looking great, but it looks like they're lived in. It looks like there's still some love and care. It just looks poor. And then we get to this one lot, and he says, "Stop here." And he turns to me and says, "Don't even get out of the car. I'm gonna go in, and I'm gonna be back out. Don't leave me, Angel. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here." And he steps out of the car and heads to this lot where there's this little shack. It literally looks like somebody had taken those plywood boards that they stack crates on top of and had leaned them up against each other and made this shelter out of it. It was so small, and it had a metal gate and one of those chain link fences in front of it. And he's bending the gate. He's trying to open the gate, and it's locked, and he ends up jumping over the fence after bending it around and doing some stuff that wasn't great for it. Added to the already run down look to the place. And he walks inside and has to bend down because the ceiling is too low for him. The entryway is too low for him. I mean, the house wasn't much taller than he was, and this guy was like 6'4", something like that, and the house was maybe an inch or two taller than he was. I can't imagine what it was like for him in there. And I'm sitting there in the car. I turned the engine off, but I'm sitting there in the car with the window down. And it's maybe 30 seconds before he comes back out with this older woman walking behind him. She didn't look that much older than he was, but her hair was completely white. Completely white. And she was maybe 5'5". She was not a big woman. And he stepped out of the house and she followed him, and he gave her a hug for a good 10 seconds, and then it was one of the most saddest things I've ever seen, where he let go of her, and it's like one of those things, one of those scenes where I would imagine what it's like for people to be letting go of a pet that they don't want to let go of, but they simply can't afford not to, you know? Where it's this dog, and you give it that final goodbye hug, and you start walking off, and the dog follows you and kind of starts rubbing up against your leg, and you can't help but turn back and give the dog another hug. It's exactly what it was like here. He would start walking away, and he'd only get a few steps, and his mother would be right behind him, and I guess she was saying something or something. But he'd turn around and he'd give her another hug, and he'd turn back, and he'd start walking back towards me. And he had to stop because she was right on top of him. And he turned around and gave her another hug, and he finally got to the fence. That happened like 3 or 4 times. He finally got to the fence, jumped it, and very briskly walked back around to the passenger side of the car, opened the door, got inside, and closed the door behind him. And he turns to me and says, "Go. Just go." And there's tears streaming out his eyes. And I turn the car on and I start going, and I look off to my left, and his mother has opened the gate for us to drive inside. And I felt so sad. What would drive this man to not want to visit with his mother more than a few seconds? Why would he not want to stay? And I felt bad for not staying. I felt bad for not driving in there. But he told me some stories later on as we were leaving Yakima that I won't share here. They're his stories, and maybe when I think he's passed on, I'll share them. But we ended up heading back through Yakima, and um, he was telling me all sorts of stories about his mother that were not happy, and some other things that he had done when he was younger. And as we went along through the area, we passed by different houses and different acreages, and he pointed out and said, "Yeah, I remember going to so and so's place there, and maybe there'd be like a pretty redhead or something like that, or or this guy would be there." And we get back onto the highway, and I go. And as we're leaving Yakima, the border of Yakima, we pull into a rest stop and take a break there. Good hour long nap or something like that. Um, and and then we stopped by at a convenience store, and he got himself something else spiked. and he was chugging on that for a while. And we started driving. We started driving, and there were a lot of things I wanted to say, but I didn't. I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. And at some point, he started nodding off after our nap. But we would pass by different places, and he'd continue to tell me stories. But that's not the end of mine. That's just the first half of it. And I think I'll save that for another time. I think I'll have another one of these story times to share with you guys. And I'll finish it up there, because the adventure does not end there. With my journey with the troubled stranger. But let me know what you guys thought of this story so far, and if you'd like to hear more about it. And I'd be more than happy to do so. So let me know in the comments below. And hit that like button if you really did enjoy. But I do prefer comments because it lets me know what you guys thought of it and what you'd like to hear. And this is just one of the many stories I have from going into Idaho, but this is one of the few that isn't directly related to the wilderness school. So, I'll share the rest of the story at some point in the near future. And until then, I hope you guys enjoyed and have a wonderful day. Take care, everybody, and bye for now.